Good afternoon, everybody. It's Gustavo again here, winemaker at Mira Winery. And today we're going to taste a couple of really special wines, ones that I'm extremely fond of. So I was really happy when we were asked which wines we wanted to re-release for the library tasting. I thought it interesting to try these two wines. It's Cabernet Franc, single vineyard, single varietal. So it's 100% Cabernet Franc, two different vintages. And so I'll take you, through both of the wines so we can taste them. They're pretty close in vintage, so you might be surprised at the differences that you're going to see between the two. I'm happy to answer any questions. So far when I've done these, it's been a pretty interactive session, which I really enjoy. And so as you send the messages in, our moderator will text them to me, and then I'll look on my phone once we get close to the end of me having anything more to say. And I'll answer your questions about this wine, or if you saw my video yesterday on Instagram about what I was doing in the cellar, any winemaking related questions are welcome as well. I'd love to show people what we do in the cellar. So, anything that piques your interest, I'm happy to answer. So, again, thanks for joining. And so we got two Cabernet Francs. They're from a vineyard in Carneros, and the two wines, the main difference between the two is, of course, is the vintage, but also the age of the vines of the wines that ended up in there. So basically, the 2012 is the last vintage that the really old vineyard that was planted Cabernet Franc 20 years ago in 2012, it would have been like 25 years ago or so, produced grapes, and it was 100% that, or produced grapes to make the 100% Cabernet Franc. So it's a clone of Cabernet Franc called the Nebom clone, and for those of you that joined on Pinot a couple times, I've explained what clones are, and they're basically a variation on the varietal. So some clones ripen sooner, some later, some have smaller grapes, some big grapes, but it's all essentially the same varietal. In this case, we're talking about Cabernet Franc, and so the clone for this is. The street name for it anyway, and there's a much more less interesting technical name for it, but it's called the Nebom clone. And that's because when Napa first started out, there was a really famous winery that Coppola owns now that was called Inglenook. And the proprietor of Inglenook was Gustav Nebom. And he's the one, or somebody in his team, is the one that was responsible for bringing that bootleg clone, because they snuck it into the country from Bordeaux. So the origin is Bordeaux. No one is really sure exactly where. The word on the street or the romantic side of it says it wants to be from Cheval Blanc, but which is on the other side of the river near Saint-Emilion from the town of Bordeaux. And it's a really famous vineyard that makes really famous wine. So I can understand why you would want to have material from that vineyard, but it's quite different, even if it's that clone. And the variation between, for example, where the Inglenook winery was, which is now Coppola, as I mentioned, up in Rutherford, is much different from where these grapes grow in Carneros. So even though it's, on a good day with no traffic, it's about a 15-minute drive, there's a pretty intense difference in the way the weather is down in Carneros compared to Rutherford. And so we have a much cooler environment for a varietal that potentially thrives more in warmer weather, grows in. So couple that with the idea also that these vines, when it was later in their life, here in the 25 to 30 year range of age, the vines also, which happens a lot too, believe it or not, is the vines have developed a virus, and a lot of different varietals are susceptible to different viruses, and it causes the leaves basically to go from green, which is what we need to ripen fruit and for the plant to really work. The green leaves are just like radar antennas that photosynthesize to allow the plant to do its thing. And once the leaves are no longer green, it's not really doing anything anymore. It's just kind of living, but it's not really working anymore. And so what happens with this disease is they go from green leaves to red leaves, and that could be pretty much anywhere along its life during that harvest. So it's not consistent any year that the vines were always going to go from green to red when there's about 20% sugar or 23% sugar. It varies depending on the vintage, and nobody really understands what the conditions are that allow it to show up early on or later on. But anyway, the point is that with the 2012 vintage, with some vines having this virus and some vines not, and being a really small vineyard and being a very varied block as well, where some, when you walk this vineyard, there were 4 long rows of it, And some of the vines, you could see they were planted directly over stones, which is, there's kind of a dried up creek where they planted this vineyard. And the creek is still there, but it's moved a little bit. So the stones are still there, but the water is no longer there. But you still have the result of the creek being there. And so you couple that, the really lack of water holding capacity in the soil with this virus, and you're in for something totally unique. And so you add to that the different weather in Carneros, which isn't so hot that the wines are gonna, or the grapes are gonna ripen in a hurry, or in the case of this specific Cabernet Franc, where it's no longer using its own energy to ripen the grapes. The other risk is that if you're in a warmer environment, you're going to raisin the grapes if it gets hot. The vines are no longer producing the sugar, but the lack of humidity in the air is producing raisins on the vines, and so you get more sugar because of the lack of humidity and just the raising and the concentration that happens in the grapes. So being in Carneros, you're kind of protected from that. And what I really loved about this wine is just how clear of an expression of Cabernet Franc this is. For those of you that don't know, Cabernet Franc is related to Cabernet Sauvignon, and for the most part, Cabernet Franc has been blended into Cabernet Sauvignon. And there's not too many producers that are doing 100% Cabernet Francs out there anywhere in the world, really. And it's interesting because Cabernet Sauvignon is a child of Cabernet Franc. So there were some genetic studies that were done at UC Davis about 20 years ago, where they determined that the two parents of Cabernet Sauvignon are Cabernet Franc on the one hand, and then the other one is Sauvignon Blanc, which surprisingly, right? So, but if you think about the name Cabernet Sauvignon, it kind of makes sense. Somewhere along the way, whoever was doing their thing in the vineyard that crossed these two or discovered the Cabernet Sauvignon knew that maybe they came from these two, and he gave it that name, which is pretty curious, I think, and then kind of proven by science later on. So anyway, all that to say that some of the characteristics that you find in Cabernet Sauvignon, you're going to find in Cabernet Franc as well, and vice versa, obviously, right? There's the share of natural characteristics in Cabernet Franc that add to the complexity of Sauvignon, but I think on their own, the Cabernet Franc characteristics to me are just so much more interesting and noble, and I like wines that are a little bit more elegant, and I think Cabernet Franc is much more aristocratic and elegant to me than Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon, we love it because it's fruity, but it can also have plenty of structure and power, and it can also be elegant, but I think the Cabernet Franc is just kind of unique in its characteristics. Some of the typical characteristics of Cabernet Franc, especially from these older clones, and especially from areas where it's a little bit cooler and the grapes don't get quite as ripe, is pencil shavings. It's one of the, I would say, for lack of a better term, faults of Bordeaux red varietals and even white varietals, including Sauvignon Blanc, is there's this grassiness that stays in the grape if you don't get it ripe enough, or if you don't expose it to sun for a long enough period for it to burn off these chemicals that give it kind of this bell pepper, kind of green vegetal character into the wine. And the Sauvignon Blancs have that as well. And in some cases, that gives you different flavors in Sauvignon Blanc that people like in New Zealand attribute to their terroir. But in reality, a lot of it has to do with the nature of the grape itself having those characters. And so most people don't enjoy that character. It's produced from the chemical that produces, called a methoxypyrazine, and so we just refer to them as pyrazines in the winemaking world. And one of the things that we look for around here, especially, but I think the rest of the world has kind of caught up to what we do here, is we look for as little or a complete absence of these pyrazines to pick the grapes. So for me, that's kind of like the first indicator that the grapes are ripe. I don't like to wait till the grapes are so concentrated and fruity and just full of sugar also, because I don't want to make too high of an alcohol wine. And so for me, the biggest indicator that starts to tell me that the grapes are ready to harvest is when this herbal character goes away, this green vegetal character, and that takes a while. It's primarily to do with sun exposure and warmth, and as you can imagine, in Carneros, there's not quite as much warmth or sun exposure as there is further north. Even in Yalgo, where we are with the winery, we can have a fair amount of temperature difference any given time of the day. It could be 100 degrees here and 85 down in Carneros. And what that means is these grapes are just going to take longer to ripen. And so, in fact, the Cabernet Franc pretty much comes in towards the end of our harvest season. So we begin the harvest season typically end of August, beginning of September with Pinot Noir. And then we conclude at the end of October with Cabernet Franc and Merlot from Carneros. So the cool weather down there just really stretches out the harvest. And as a comparison, Cabernet Franc usually ripens before Cabernet Sauvignon, but because our Cabernet Sauvignon comes from up valley, that ripens before this Cabernet Franc does, that's from the cooler area. So let me pour it, and this is 2012, like I mentioned. And I've got this little doohickey, and that is a technical term, on top of it. That as I've discussed before, I'm not a big fan of decanting the wines, but I do like to drink every last drop that's in there. So several years ago, I came across this device that basically is a filter that you can you stick it into the bottle and pour from it. It doesn't aerate or anything; it just filters out the gunk. And so because a lot of these wines are not filtered that we produce, and I know this 2012 in particular, if I show you the cork, there's a fair amount of sediment on there, that you get from aging and stuff. And, this being an older wine, it's going to have thrown quite a bit of sediment since it wasn't filtered. And so I use this little filter to take out the gunk and not really affect the taste of the wine, not at all affect the taste of the wine as I pour into my glass. So as you check it out, let me pour a little bit more here. What you'll notice in this 2012 Cabernet Franc is just this real typicity of the varietal. So I spoke about what the varietal has when it's not ripe, and it's possible that when you don't have perfect ripeness, you still have a little bit of those characteristics, those vegetal characters. But when it does get ripe, and for me, the optimum ripeness, not overripe, you get some pretty unique characters of Cabernet Franc, and they're signature to Cabernet Franc. So if you go overboard and you're too ripe, you just get a lot of fruit. You get some shared characteristics that you might get in Cabernet Sauvignon. You might get some figgy characters, some raisiny characters, and things like that. But when you hit the sweet spot in between underripe and just right ripe and overripe, you really pick up on these signature aromas and characteristics of Cabernet Franc, and that stays in the wine. So I think a lot of that, for me, the best way to describe it is the pencil shavings. And like when you first sharpen a pencil, if people still use their number 2 pencils from long ago, that's kind of what the first thing that it reminds me of is pencil shavings, lead, graphite, that kind of thing. And so this wine growing in a cooler area just really has this explosive aroma, right? And for me, this being a 2012 still has quite a strong aroma. It doesn't smell or necessarily look like an aged wine to me. One of the things about Cabernet Franc that's a little bit different is it produces a lighter colored wine for the most part. I think this still looks, for those of you lucky to have it, I think you'll see it's still pretty good color. There's not a lot of signs of oxidation. It's not quite as dark as a Cabernet Sauvignon maybe. And this particular clone and all the other things that I talked about going on with this specific vineyard just kind of maintains this reddish, darkish red color more so. And it's still, to me, I'm surprised, continue to be surprised at how young it looks. And then when I smell it, I don't have any aromas of a wine that's old or aged. And we tasted a 2009 red wine that we produced that we're going to taste later on with everybody as well, that does have those characteristics of aged wine. And interestingly enough, that red wine has a little bit of Cabernet Franc in it. But I don't get any of those characters here at all. I get a lot of just pure Cabernet Franc character. And so this specific vintage was a really, really good vintage in the Napa Valley. It's kind of like it's a benchmark vintage for us in Napa, and pretty much all across the board, the wines that were made that year were just extraordinary, stellar, just about everything. I think I think the critics pretty much gave it 100 points as a vintage for the 2012, and so we were able to make some really, really good wine that year as well. And I think this Cabernet Franc is a pretty good benchmark for what I was looking to do with Cabernet Franc in terms of the aromas, the colors, and just the texture of the wine and the characteristics that you pick up in the wine. So, as I mentioned, it's a small vineyard. It only produced in this vintage about 150 cases. So there's not a lot to go around. And so any chance I get to try it out, I'm always really happy to do so. And if one of my go-to wines here in the tasting room in Napa, in Yountville, has been Cabernet Franc, and specifically I was tasting this 12 pretty often with people when they would come visit, and I'd host a visit for them. This is one of my special wines that I would go to share with them, just because I think it's such a unique wine, and there's just not a lot of Cabernet Franc out there, and there's not a lot of single vineyard, single varietal Cabernet Franc out there either. So really special. So in terms of the winemaking, before I get into the taste aspect of this, the winemaking is pretty simple. You know, it's we harvest at that critical ripeness that I was describing earlier, and then the technique is we sit on it before fermentation for about 4 to 6 days cold, and then after that we get the fermentation going. That takes about 7 to 10 days. And Cabernet Franc, I would say, is a little bit more, especially from Carneros, a little bit more delicate than Cabernet Sauvignon. And so I don't quite beat up on it as much. And by that, I mean, I don't try to extract too much out of it, because, you know, you get what you get when you're extracting, but you don't want to go overboard in your regime to extract, because you could damage the fruit and get some characters that you don't want into the wine. So I'm looking to maintain some of these really elegant and softer characteristics in the wine, rather than bring in any kind of harshness from overdoing it with the pump overs or the cap management that we talk about when we extract the color and the flavors into the wine. So this spends about 20-25 days total in the tank. So that includes the cold maceration in the beginning, the 7 to 10 day fermentation, and I think in this particular vintage it was about 8 days. And then after that, the warm maceration period. Once the fermentation is complete and we have our alcohol content, I still want to keep extracting a little bit. So I leave it on the skins for, you know, this vintage was about 20-25 days. I think it was more like 25 if I remember off the top of my head. And then after that, it went into 50% new French oak barrels and 50% already used barrels. And that was also to not dominate the wine with a lot of oak, but just bring in a little bit of oak to help lift the wine into a different quality category. And for me, you know, as I've talked about before, in terms of oak, I'm not looking to drown the wine in oak. And the first thing that I want people to pick up when they smell the wine is definitely not oak. It's more the essence of the wine, and the oak is mixed in there. But I don't want, you know, for me, what I try to avoid is when you put the wine to your nose and say, oh, wow, that's got a lot of oak on it. So I try to avoid any kind of vanilla butterscotch characters in barrels that give me that kind of characteristic. So, you know, in this vintage, to keep it as pure as possible, I've relied on this 50% new oak only. And you know, when you make 150 cases, you're talking about 6 barrels or so, you know, of new ones and 6 used ones, basically. So not a whole lot. And then it stayed in the barrels for 18 months. During that time frame, we went through the secondary fermentation, which is the malolactic fermentation, the conversion of malic acid to lactic acid, and that makes the wine a little bit softer. Being in Carneros, you retain more acidity, and having the virus vines, they also retain more acidity. So going through the secondary fermentation helps to soften the wine a little bit, and not be quite as harsh on the palate from the acidity. And so aged for 18 months, and as I spoke with the little device that's on here, the wine goes to the bottle non-filtered, and then at least a year in the bottle before we release it. So this wine, you know, I think we only had 10 cases available, and I was really excited to have people taste it, because most people don't get to see what an aged wine really is like, especially 100% varietal from Napa. So I'm really excited to share this with people. So back to the taste and back to the aroma. I think what you find, the aroma is just so complex and so compelling. It's really hard to put a finger on any one special characteristic of the wine, but I definitely pick up the graphite nose. I pick up a little bit of wood and kind of like a fall forest smell to it with dried leaves and things like that. A little bit of fruit, but I get more kind of foresty character out of the wine, and maybe a little bit of mushroom and things like that. You know, it reminds me more of fall smells than anything else. It's a pretty intense nose, though, and that's the other thing. It doesn't punch you in the face, but there's a lot going on in the nose, and you don't have to stick your nose too deep into the glass to get the aromas. It's a pretty focused aroma that's just easy to get. And so when you taste the wine, then those aromas carry over into the palate as well, but not quite as big in the palate. You get other flavor profiles on the palate. And one of the things that surprised me too is there's still acidity present in the wine, but it's become a lot more round and supple than it was maybe even 6 or 7 months ago when I was tasting it more often out of the tasting room. But it has this really, really long finish, this really long return. So the return is basically after you've already tasted and swallowed the wine. There's a flavor that just kind of comes back and lingers in your mouth, on your palate, and it has a lot of kind of like anise or black licorice kind of character, but not like in a strong way, in a very subtle way. It's got a lot of aromatics still that linger on your palate. Yeah, I'm really impressed with this wine. So the more I taste it, the more I can probably just sit here and drink it. But you guys don't need to see that. We can do that off camera. So let's go on to the 13. We can come back to the 12. I'm gonna switch over the filter just because I know this one has a little bit of stuff in it too. This particular bottle of 12 didn't have too much stuff in it, so it's pretty interesting. You know, you're gonna get, because the wines aren't filtered and the wine is kind of old now. You know, you're gonna get bottle bottle variation. So some bottles might have more sediment than others, and some might not have any sediment at all. So let me pour the 13 then. And so interesting thing about the 13 is that the 12 was pretty much the last vintage that it was 100% the Nibong clone of Cabernet Franc. What happened is the family that owns this vineyard, the Hyde family, they wanted to replant the vineyard, and so they asked to trial a different clone, a more modern clone from Bordeaux, right? Because the feeling is that that part of Napa, being cooler and whatnot, maybe is more similar to Bordeaux. So maybe having, in terms of temperatures and things like that, not necessarily rain, but more temperatures and things like that. And so maybe a clone that did well in Bordeaux could do well in this region as well. So he asked me, the owner asked me to trial the new clone and compare it to the clone that we'd been using up until that point. And so 13 was the first vintage that new clone came into being. And so what happened in 13 is I ended up making a blend out of the two clones. The 12, what ends up happening on vines as they get older is not only might they be affected by a virus, but they also start producing less grapes, less and less and less grapes. And that's one of the reasons to pull the vineyard is, you know, once you don't have any more grapes and you're just growing leaves, there's no more wine to be made. So, you know, that's when you make your decision to move on. And then it gets kind of fun because you have to decide what you're going to put in there, and maybe what you had in there before doesn't exist anymore, or it gives you a chance to change things around. And so anyway, the idea was to plant a little bit of this new clone from Bordeaux, and the characteristics of this clone, what they like about it in Bordeaux is that it's a more fruity type clone than maybe this older clone that we had before. And so for Bordeaux, trying to make fruitier wines, it's important for them to have this clone that gives them more fruit character. And also the ripening, it's a clone that's a little bit easier to get ripe and kind of get away from those green herbal characters earlier on that I was describing. Get over that sooner in the course of the grapes becoming ripe, so that when they pick the grapes, they don't have to deal with as much vegetal character. So the idea was this could work in Carneros and maybe produce a really compelling wine there as well. So we agreed to do this trial. There were another 4 rows of this planted, and so the production in 12 and 13 between the old block and the new block was pretty much the same amount of fruit. So I kept both of the lots separate and allowed them to age separately and put them in different kinds of barrels just to see what was going to happen. Same profile, 50% new, 50% used, and just kind of evaluated with the thought of, you know, if they're not complementary wines, or I'm not going to blend the two clones and call it Cabernet Franc. So, you know, it was a lot of tasting during the 18 months at this age as well, same as the 12, 18 months. And to see and verify that the two could get along together and produce an interesting wine. And so what ended up happening was the 13, the new block, was just so fruity that it kind of complemented the earthiness, let's say, of the 12 of the older clone from that vintage. but it seemed to dominate it in the beginning, and so I kept kind of going back and forth of whether I liked the two together or not, because I wasn't trying to make just this really fruity expression of Cabernet Franc. I really liked the expression that I gotten before with this elegance and just kind of more of a restrained Cabernet Franc rather than this full fruit on Cabernet Franc. But what I found during the course of aging, as we got closer to the 18 months, was that it became really complementary to the wine, really complementary to the other clone of Cabernet Franc. And so I decided to go for it and put the two together. So again, in 13, it was 150 cases that were produced. So not any difference in production in terms of what the two Cabernet Francs produced, but the the Nibam clone produced much less Cabernet Franc that year. So as I was saying, this blend is about a 50-50 blend of the new clone with the old clone. And so as we aged the wine then, interestingly enough, the new clone that doesn't have the virus, also because of the cool area, just never really developed a lot of sugar. So we maintained a similar type of alcohol profile in the wine, which was a real plus, knowing that it wasn't going to accumulate so much alcohol or so much sugar so fast that I'd end up with a high alcohol wine in the end. So really happy about that. And then we bottled it, of course, unfiltered again, and aged it. And I kept just kind of going back and forth of whether or not I was enjoying the wine as much as I enjoyed the old clone. So what happened was that this fruity character kind of came back in the wine when it was young. And so it seemed to really dominate those classic graphite type characters that I really liked in the Cabernet Franc from before. But then what I found as it started to age more and more in the bottle is it came around and it just developed into this other Cabernet Franc that was, yes, different from the 12 and different from that old clone, but equally compelling to me, and equally as powerful and as interesting to me as what was there before. But it just had more substance to it now. It seemed like it had more meat on the bone than what was there beforehand. So if we look at the wine now, and you look at the color, it's a pretty similar color to the 12. Again, Cabernet Francs don't have a lot of color to begin with. You don't expect this black, inky wine. You expect it to be in the red realm, reddish to purple, and just not, something that it's something you're going to be able to see through. And so this is no different. The wine is still quite young looking, and then when you smell it, when you approach the aromas, it still has the intense aromas, but I think, interestingly enough, the 13 aromas are a little bit less apparent than the 12. But you do pick up more of these type of fruit aromas. So it's pretty interesting to compare the two. I mean, they're quite different on the nose. I don't get a lot of the graphite nose that I was expecting to get this time around, and maybe the bottle is still in the process of aging. But I do get more fruit. I get a little bit of tiny bit of fig character. But let me pour a little bit more on, because maybe I didn't pour enough in there to try to get more of the aromas out. And so I pick up a little bit of this forest character that I described in the 12. But there's more of an underlying berry character, and when I think of the berries, it's more like a riper blueberry or an even riper blackberry. If you ever had the blackberries just kind of sitting around in your refrigerator and they start getting a little bit mushy, that's kind of what it reminds me of. But again, to compare with the 12, I'm a little bit surprised that the volume, the intensity of the aroma is not as high as the 12. And so to me, the 12 is really standing out in terms of the power of the aromas. All right, so let's taste it then, and maybe we'll get a little bit more in the flavor than we got in the aromas. So definitely in the taste, what you're going to notice is there's a lot more to the texture and to the flavor components on the 13 than the 12. And I'm definitely seeing much more of the fruit, but what I'm also seeing is more of the tannin, more of the astringency on the flavor. And what's sticking around more compared to the 12, where I got a lot of aromas that were just kind of hanging out, I get more of that, the tannin, which is kind of the thing that dries out your mouth a little bit, the puckeriness. I get more of that that's sticking around compared to the 12. But it's interesting that I get a lot of fruit, the tannin wrapped in fruit, and I'm trying to decide what the fruit characteristic is that I'm picking up on this. I think I'm still picking up some of the more kind of herbs, not herbal or vegetal, but more of the herbs that I was talking about with the on the 12. I still get a little bit of licorice, a little bit of anise. But there's quite a bit of fruit on there, and it's a really lovely wine. I mean, the tannin. I think it's if I have to pick one fruit right now that pops into mind when I taste it, it's plums. It's got a real plummy character to it, and even if you ever tasted a plum before it's completely ripe and you taste the skin, it kind of reminds me of the skin of the plum a little bit, and the astringency that it has is a little bit kind of in that ballpark to me. It's a pretty fascinating wine, I think. I mean, it's definitely more powerful than the 12. I compare the two now. I feel like the 13 is just now starting to open up compared to the 12. Yeah, the 12 just has much more of the classic Cabernet Franc characters, and by that I mean, like, what you would expect from maybe an old school Bordeaux is what that reminds me more of. And the 13 just brings in more fruit elements, more density, more viscosity. It's interesting that the acidity on the 13 seems to be more apparent to me, but that's also in conjunction with the tannins, and it's just a really long-lasting finish again, but different than the 12, where the 12 is more about flavors and aromas. This the long-lasting finish on this is more about the texture and what you feel versus what you smell in your mouth, which is pretty interesting. I think these wines still have a pretty long life ahead of them. The 12 is going on almost 10 years. I think it'd be interesting to continue to compare these as they age, but there's not a lot to go around, so I try to keep some so that I can taste it maybe 5-10 years from now to see what it's like. But I think the staying power of these wines is pretty remarkable, and I think the life, the route that they've taken from when they were young to where they are now, I think the wines are just, while they're pretty fun when they're young, they just become much more interesting wines as they age. So I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was really happy to release these two vintages of the Cabernet Franc so that you could see kind of what goes on with these, and you can compare maybe with some older varietals of some other wines that you might have. So always fun to taste these wines, maybe pull them out of the cellar occasionally and see what's going on with them, and check in on them. One of the questions that I get often is, how long will a wine age? And for the most part, we can take a pretty good guess if it's a Bordeaux varietal from Napa that it's going to age 25, 30 years. But it's fun to keep checking in on it every so often. If you can keep some bottles put away and see what it's doing, and know that the last time you tasted it was 2 years ago, that you might be in for a surprise of how it's tasting now, and it might be completely different than it was before. And that's kind of what makes it fun, and if you sit there and you taste it, and maybe an old wine originally might not be what you were expecting, and not necessarily the profile of wines that you like, the more that you sit there and you enjoy it, you kind of have an understanding of what's happening with that wine over time. And you might actually be surprised at, once you get to your final glass in the bottle, that it's a much different wine than it was when you first started out. One of the things I stress is to keep in mind that these wines, if it's an older wine, they've been sitting in the bottle for a pretty long time. So when you first open them, while you might be impressed by the aromas and stuff like that, it's only going to open up more the more open it is, and the more time that it spends in the bottle, partially filled and also in your glass as you're swirling it around and stuff, you start really to see that wine kind of reawaken and show you how it's evolved. And a lot of those flavors, like I said, are just so much more interesting sometimes than when the wine is young. So that's pretty much the lowdown on those two wines. With that, I'm going to see if I have any questions, which I hope I do. So let me have a look and see what we got. All right, so from Tom Sherry, is the only way to control pyrazine through time of harvest? Okay, so that's a really good question, Tom. So the best and most natural way to do that is through timing of harvest. I mean, there are things that you can do in the cellar. There's a lot of things that people can sell you that you can put into the wine to reduce the amount of pyrazines that you have in the wine or that you notice in the wine, right? They're still going to be there, but you can kind of mask them with different types. Even with oak, you can mask them with oak. You can try to burn them off in your fermentation. So, and by that I mean when you expose it to air, a lot of the pyrazine some of the pyrazine starts blowing off, and you start losing it. But you never really know because you can measure it, but the flavors kind of come and go of the pyrazines. One day it seems like you completely are over the greenness and the pyrazines. Another day you go back and oh my God, they're back. And so if you haven't gotten rid of them by the time that you bring the fruit into the winery, you're going to have a really hard time just getting rid of them in general. And like I said, there are things that you can add to the wine to mask a little bit the pyrazines and maybe give them a different flavor element. The other option is to do, as they used to describe in France, which is pretty much what they used to tell you in Bordeaux is, you don't want to drink any of the wines until they're 7 years old. And a lot of that is to mitigate some of this pyrazine that's in the wine at bottling that over time will transform into some different types of characteristics in the bottle. So, bottle age will help you get through it. If you can't do it with your harvest timing, definitely bottle age will do it. Otherwise, what some producers choose to do is to use ingredients to help reduce maybe the apparent flavors and aromas of pyrazines. So that's a really good question. It's not that easy to do. We're lucky in Napa that because of the weather that we have here, we don't really have to deal with pyrazines that much anymore. If we have an unusual vintage like 2011, is where it becomes more of a challenge, where we have cool weather at the time of harvest and our hang time didn't allow us to get rid of the pyrazines. But for the most part, other vintages, we really don't have that much of an issue doing so, and the only people that might have an issue are the ones that are harvesting. We've had the fashion of low alcohols the last few years, and people that like to harvest on the early side because they want to have less sugar to convert to alcohol. Those are the ones that might have issues with pyrazines in their wine. But other than that, here in Napa, because the weather is so good and we have so much sunshine and the road directions that we've been using lately when we do plantings allow us to have proper sun exposure to get rid of the pyrazines. It's not really something that we have to worry about here too much anymore. And we're pretty lucky to have that. It's a great area to grow these Bordeaux varietals because we can get through and get pretty much any kind of ripening we want any given vintage. All right, let's see what else we got. Questions. Also from Tom, does the oak help to mellow or soften the pyrazines like other compounds? So that's exactly what I was saying. Is the oak helps a little bit, kind of it mellows it in the fact in a way that it kind of hides the pyrazine. So that's the thing that people add is there's a recipe that you can use for stuff that you can add that's similar to oak tannins, basically oak tannins, that you can add into the tank while you're fermenting it to try to help the pyrazines bind onto this oak, right? And the hope is that once your fermentation's over, once it has bound to the oak, it settles out at the bottom of the tank and you don't have the pyrazines anymore. But there's really no foolproof way to do it. The oak also helps hide the flavor, like I keep saying, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate it 100%, or I'm not even sure that it eliminates it even 50%. So it's a real challenging thing to deal with. And of course, if we're talking about pyrazines in white wines, that's a whole other ballgame with Sauvignon Blanc that's got pyrazines in it. And that just requires just a lot of time if you have it in the wine for it to turn into something that's a little bit more agreeable to the palate. All right, so let's see another question. And let me look here. Let me the question is from Tom, what are the pros and cons of barrel filtering before bottling? I'm not sure I understand barrel filtering before bottling. So, Tom, if you want to clarify that, filtering it before it goes to barrel, or I'm not really sure I understand that. Because I mean, there's some people that choose to filter their wines at the end of fermentation and put the filtered wine into the barrel so that it's a cleaner wine, let's say. But that's not something that I like to do. I like to from the time the wine gets drained and pressed and goes into the tank to get ready for barreling down, I like to have a little bit of solids in the wine, and those solids help give the wine even more flavor and more complexity as it ages. So it's something that you have to be careful with, because if there's too many solids in there, or if you're not moving the solids in the barrel, they start giving you these off characteristics and off aromas. But it helps the wine age, believe it or not, a little bit longer. So even though we go into the barrel with a little bit of sediment or a little bit of solids, the hope is that over the time that we're aging the wine, that those eventually come out, and so we don't have to filter the wine out after the 18 months that we've been producing the wine in the barrel. So that's kind of my goal. So, okay, Tom said I already addressed the question. Okay, great. Great. Do I keep saying 13? I meant 14. But that kind of happens when we've been working in the cellar all day today doing different things. So, slip of mind. But anyway, these are really good questions, and a lot of it, a lot of what we're doing here is to try to produce the wine in as natural a way as possible, right? And so of course, when the vintage throws you a curveball, you kind of have to know how to react to it and how you're gonna deal with what the vintage is giving you. You still, like in my case, I still want to make sure that I'm representing what's on the bottle, the compliance stuff, which is the vineyard or the varietal or the year or all that stuff that's on there, and also be true to my brand, Mira, and what I'm trying to accomplish as a winemaker of Mira wines. I want as much purity of the wines as possible, and I don't like using products, and I don't like to add things into the wine that I feel like maybe I could have resolved in a different way, in a more natural way, and that goes back to the vintage, right? So maybe in a vintage like 2011, I'm not able to wait for my pyrazines to resolve in the vineyard. Just like what happens in France most years is they might not be able to wait for that pyrazine to go away. So in that case, what do? Do I do different kinds of aerated pump overs to try to reduce the amount of pyrazine and try to get it to blow off with the air? Do I increase my barrel aging? Do I put a little bit of more new oak on there to try to mask a little bit that pyrazine? Or do I just kind of let it ride and just let it resolve over time and maybe not release the wine before those pyrazines are resolved in the bottle? So, there's different options to take. It's just a matter of do you want to take the shortcuts, or do you want to, try to take, sometimes it takes you longer to make the wine in a natural way. And that's kind of the philosophy that I have more, is I want to make it natural, and maybe if it takes me a little bit longer, that's what I'm going to do. All right, so let's see if I got another question here. All right, from Oscar, is there a Cabernet Franc label you try to shoot for your Cabernet Franc? Well, that's a good question, Oscar. Am I trying to? Is there a Cabernet Franc that I try to emulate mine from it, if I'm understanding your question? And the answer is no. While there's a lot of Cabernet Francs that I love, and there's a few Italian Cabernet Francs that I'm really, really fond of, and of course, There's the Cabernet Francs from Bordeaux that I really, really like. I would say I'm not necessarily after the characteristics of a Cabernet Franc that maybe I enjoy, but I try to represent more what is going on in the place where the Cabernet Franc is being grown. So I think my representation is, and of course you're going to make something that you like to drink, right? So that's kind of what I'm doing here is I'm trying to understand, and I've been making this Cabernet Franc now for several years, what Cabernet Franc from Carneros is like, and that's what I'm trying to emulate here in this wine, right? So if I was making a Cabernet Franc from, in a couple of years we'll have our Yountville Cabernet Franc from our property when that comes online, and we actually have both of the clones that we have in this younger version of this Franc planted on our property as well. I would expect that it's going to have a little bit different characteristics in these, and that's kind of what I'm going to try to bring into the bottling is the characteristics of the Cabernet Franc grown in that soil that year and made by me. So that's a really good question. Let's see. Also from Oscar, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but how do you treat Cabernet Franc differently from Cabernet Sauvignon? All right, so that's a really good question too. So this is something that I touched on a different session, and basically what was happening I would almost venture to say in the New World in general is that people were treating Bordeaux varietals as if they were all the same. So people were treating Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, all pretty much the same, whether in the vineyard as in the winery. And I would also add to that, when I started my career here, the way that even other non-Bordeaux red varietals were made, they were all kind of made in the same fashion. Everybody did pretty much the same thing to the different varietals to make their wine. And so eventually what started happening is people started realizing, and the more people traveled and they saw what people were doing in other parts of the world where maybe they had a longer experience making these wines, that you don't treat these varietals the same, right? Merlot has its own characteristics. Cabernet Franc has its own characteristics. Cabernet Sauvignon has its own characteristics. And even though, as I was saying earlier, Cabernet Sauvignon is the son of Cabernet Franc, it's not entirely like Cabernet Franc, right? Cabernet Sauvignon has other characteristics that maybe it's gained from its other parent, Sauvignon Blanc, that make it a little bit different. And so one of the primary differences between Franc and Sauvignon is that Sauvignon just needs much longer hang time than Cabernet Franc. So if we have Cabernet Sauvignon planted in our vineyard here in Yountville as well, and what's going to end up happening is that I'll pick the Cabernet Franc, it'll be ready to be harvested, and we'll be through the pyrazines and stuff like that, probably a good 2 to 3 weeks before the Cabernet Sauvignon will be ready to be harvested. So Cabernet Sauvignon just requires more time on the vine than Cabernet Franc does, and that's to also to get rid of these pyrazines, but also to have more of these flavors evolve into the grapes. In terms of making the wine, Cabernet Franc is a more delicate grape, and so I don't beat it up as much as I do the Sauvignon in the cellar. The Sauvignon is, you could say, a little bit of a rascal, that it's not as easy to get all the stuff out of it, to extract all the stuff out of it. So you have to maybe work it a little bit harder, or a lot harder in some vintages, to get its full potential of flavors out into the wine. Whereas Cabernet Franc, if you do that, you run the risk of shredding the skins and getting bitterness and other flavors that maybe I don't want in the wine if I beat it up so much. Whereas in Sauvignon, it kind of requires you to do that before you get everything into it. So that's a really good question. And it's important to distinguish, that there are differences between all of the varietals, and we don't want to treat the varietals the same in the vineyard, nor in the winery, and nor in the way that we make the wine, not only in terms of the fermentation regime, but also in how we age it and how we cellar it in terms of barrel use and stuff like that. I use different barrels in Cabernet Franc that I use in Cabernet Sauvignon, and I might use some of the same barrels in Franc in Sauvignon, but I don't necessarily use all the Sauvignon type barrels in the Franc. So I look for a different type of oak profile, as I was describing earlier, in the Franc than I do in the Sauvignon. So really good question. Okay, I got another one from Oscar. And what grape varietal would you use to blend to reduce pyrazines in Cabernet if you had to? So I would say in the varietals that I have available to me in Napa Valley, if I had to reduce the pyrazine content by blending, I'd probably go to a Syrah.
but I'd have to be really careful how much Syrah I would add, because Syrah can be really, really dominant, right? So, and this is just assuming that all the Bordeaux varietals from the same vintage would give me pyrazines, right? If I'm having a difficult time ripening one, I might have a difficult time ripening another. But, you know, as I'm saying this, keep in mind what I just said about different varietals, even though coming from the same origin, Bordeaux, have different hang time requirements. So what ends up happening, for example, in Bordeaux is in years where they don't get the Cabernet Sauvignon ripen up because the rains came sooner than they wanted, they're going to rely much more on Merlot to make their wine than they will Sauvignon, because maybe Merlot got through the pyrazines and Sauvignon did not. But everything else being equal, if I couldn't get the pyrazines out of my Merlot or my Franc or my Petit Verdot or my Sauvignon, I'd probably rely on a varietal that's a little bit more fruit driven to help mask the pyrazines that way. So I would rely on a Syrah, which is not unusual, because in Bordeaux, when they were making the clarets a while ago, some of those wines had Syrah brought in from the Rhone Valley to blend into the Cabernet Sauvignon. So, you know, that's kind of where I picked up that trick, is I would use maybe a Rhone red varietal to help me bring in a little bit of fruitiness and thereby mask a little bit the pyrazines. So those are really, really good questions. So I'm glad you asked those. Let me see if I got any other questions, you guys. Anything else? All right, you guys. So thanks for joining. Those are excellent questions. Next week, we're going to do another one. And hopefully you can join me on that to talk about some different blendings and different aging regimes again. So, you know, if you guys get a chance, we're going to try to do these every Thursday at the same time. And, you know, for the next couple of weeks, we have a few other interesting wines to taste. So I think I got maybe one more question. And let's see. I think that's it. All right, somebody's typing something. Stand by. See if I get it. No, I guess that's it. All right, you guys. I want to thank you guys for all the questions. I do appreciate all that, and I appreciate you guys joining me. I love doing this kind of stuff and just talking about making the wines. So I look forward to seeing you guys again real soon, and I can't wait to taste more wine with you. Thanks a lot. You guys have a good rest of your day and a good Friday and weekend. Take care.